The Arizona Territory, in the year of our Lord 1889, was a place scorched by God and forgotten by man. The sun, a relentless copper eye, had burned the sky white at the edges. It was late afternoon, and the heat pressed down on the red dust plains around Sable Cross like a physical weight. This was the second year of the drought. The land itself was a testament to thirst. Great, gaping cracks split the earth as if the ground itself were crying out. The ribs of long-dead cattle poked through the dust. Monuments to failed hope. The air was thick, not with the promise of rain, but with the grit of pulverized stone, the sour tang of old sweat, and the unmistakable, heavy scent of worry. Caleb Rowan rode his horse, Ash, through this desolation. He was 38 years old, though the land and the memories had carved a decade more into his face. He was the owner of the Silver Range Ranch, a name that sounded grander than the reality. The ranch was now just a collection of weathered buildings, thirsty livestock, and dwindling hope. Ash, an old gray gelding with more sense than most men Caleb knew, picked his way carefully over the cracked terrain. Caleb was a tall man, built with the broad shoulders of a brawler, but carrying himself with the rigid discipline of his past. He had been a cavalryman for the Union, and the war had never truly left him. It remained in his eyes. A pair of watchful, calculating gray shields that always seemed to be scanning for an ambush, or measuring the distance to the nearest exit. He was checking the last trough on the southern edge of his property, the one fed by a spring that was more a damp patch of mud than a source of life. He dismounted, the leather of his saddle creaking in protest. He ran a gloved hand along the dry wood before dipping a tin cup into the murky, shallow water. Barely enough for his own string of horses, let alone the cattle he'd already sold off for pennies on the dollar. He tasted the alkali on the wind and felt the familiar knot tighten in his gut. Another month of this, and Silver Range would be nothing but a name on a foreclosure notice. It was the silence that let the new sound in. At first, it was just a disturbance, a frantic rhythm against the stillness. Then it resolved into the desperate, chaotic drumming of hoofbeats, driven too fast, too hard. A man's shout, high and thin with panic, was cut short. Then another yell, this one laced with cruel laughter. The sounds were coming from the old stagecoach road that led toward Sable Cross. Caleb's hand instinctively went to the Winchester in his saddle scabbard, his body tensing. He didn't move, just listened. The desert taught you to listen before you looked. The frantic pounding grew louder, and then, sharp and definitive, a single gunshot cracked the air. It wasn't a hunting shot. It was a killing shot. A flock of desert quail erupted from a nearby patch of scrub, their wings beating a frantic retreat from the noise. He swung himself onto Ash's back. The horse didn't need to be told. It moved toward the low dunes that separated his land from the road. Its ears pricked forward. Caleb crested the rise and pulled Ash to a halt, his blood running cold despite the heat. Below him, maybe 400 yards distant, was a disaster painted in white and red. A wedding carriage, all white paint and fancy gold trim, was overturned. One of its large wooden wheels was shattered, spokes jutting out like broken bones. Torn white lace fluttered from the window, snagged on a hostile piece of mesquite near the wreckage. A man in a black suit vest and white shirt lay face down in the red dust. He was perfectly, unnaturally still. But it wasn't the dead man or the wrecked carriage that held Caleb's gaze. It was the woman. She was a bride, or had been. Her white dress was torn at the hem, smeared with grime and something dark that looked terribly like blood. Her hands were bound in front of her, and she was running, barefoot, across the scorching sand and sharp rock. The heat would be blistering the soles of her feet, but she ran with the desperate, lung-bursting terror of a rabbit fleeing a coyote. She was not, however, an unarmed rabbit. She clutched a sawed-off shotgun, the barrel cut short, holding it awkwardly due to her bound hands. She would run 10 paces, stumble, then turn and fire back over her shoulder. The kick of the weapon nearly knocked her off her feet each time. Behind her, perhaps 50 yards back on the sand, lay a pair of delicate white wedding shoes, discarded like scraps of bone. The coyotes were close, 2 men on horseback, laughing as they pursued her. They weren't trying to catch her, not yet. They were herding her, enjoying the sport. One would spur his horse close, forcing her to veer left. Then the other would cut her off, forcing her right. They were running her to exhaustion in the brutal, unforgiving sun. Caleb didn't weigh the options. He didn't think about the trouble it would bring, or the water he didn't have, or the mortgage he couldn't pay. He saw the cavalryman's equation: 2 predators, 1 victim. The calculation was instant. He spurred Ash. The old gray horse surged down the dune, eating up the ground with a powerful, ground-covering lope. Caleb drew the Winchester from its scabbard, levering around into the chamber in the same smooth, practiced motion. The 2 men heard him coming. They turned in their saddles, their laughter dying in their throats, replaced by surprised curses. The one closer to the woman raised his pistol. He was too slow. Caleb didn't aim for the man. He aimed for the horse. But in the chaos, the man shifted. Caleb's shot took the rider square in the chest. The man was thrown from the saddle as if swatted by a giant, invisible hand, landing in a heap and not moving again. The second rider hauled his horse to a skidding stop, his eyes wide with shock. He fumbled to bring his own rifle around. Caleb didn't give him the chance. He fired again. A warning shot this time. The bullet kicked up a plume of red dust just inches from the horse's front hoof. The animal screamed and reared violently, spinning in a circle, fighting its rider for control. The man, terrified, gave up the fight with the bride and focused on staying in the saddle, finally managing to spur his panicked mount back the way it came, disappearing over the dunes in a cloud of dust. Silence descended again, heavy and immediate. The only sounds were the woman's ragged, desperate breathing and the jingle of Ash's bridle. Caleb stopped his horse 30 yards from her. He kept the Winchester level, but pointed at the ground. "It's all right, ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "They're gone." The bride's chest was heaving. She staggered, her legs trembling from exertion. Her hair, a dark auburn, had tumbled from its pins and clung to her sweat-streaked face. She turned, slow and deliberate, and brought the sawed-off shotgun up. Her bound hands made the weapon tremble, but she pointed it directly at Caleb's chest. Her eyes were not the eyes of a grateful victim. They were wide, wild, and blazing with a terrifying, absolute desperation. She was a cornered animal, past fear, past reason, living in a world that had shrunk to the space between her and the next threat. "I'd rather die than be yours," she choked out, the words ripped from her raw throat. Caleb Rowan froze. He sat perfectly still on his horse, his hands held open and away from the Colt revolver still holstered at his hip. The sun beat down on his shoulders. He could see the fine tremor in her hands, the way her knuckles were white on the shotgun. She had 1 shot left, he guessed, and she was going to use it. He was caught. He was a man who hated complications, and this woman was a walking, breathing, armed complication. He could ride away. He could leave her to the desert or to whoever else might be coming. It was the smart play. The trouble she was in was big trouble, the kind that got men killed, the kind that involved overturned wedding carriages and dead men in suits. But he looked at her eyes, and he saw something more than terror. He saw defiance. He saw a soul that had been pushed to the absolute edge and had decided to jump rather than be pushed 1 inch further. He thought of his brother, buried on a hill back at the ranch, dead for refusing to sell his water rights, dead for defiance. The rancher froze, then did the unthinkable. Slowly, so slowly it hurt. Caleb kept his eyes locked on hers. He did not speak. He reached down with his right hand, unbuckled the heavy gun belt from his waist. The Colt, his last line of defense, his constant companion for 15 years, sat heavy in its holster. He let the belt slip from his fingers. It fell to the red dust with a soft, final thud. Then he gathered Ash's reins. He turned the horse, not away from her, but sideways. He presented his back to the man he had just killed and his horse's flank to the road, turning to face the vast, open territory that belonged to the Kane family. It was a silent, insane declaration. He was showing this half-mad, terrified woman that he was willing to stand between her and the bloody carriage, between her and the power that had put her in this position. He was choosing her, a complete stranger, over his own safety. The woman stared, her mind struggling to understand the gesture. The shotgun wavered. Her eyes, which had been fixed in that burning stare, suddenly lost their focus. The adrenaline that had kept her running, kept her fighting, drained away all at once. Her knees buckled. The shotgun fell from her bound hands into the sand. She crumpled forward, a heap of torn lace and exhaustion, fainting dead away onto the hot earth. Caleb was off his horse in an instant. He knelt beside her, using his knife to slice through the ropes at her wrists. They were new ropes, and they had been tied with cruel efficiency, biting deep into her skin, leaving raw, red welts. He scooped her up. She was lighter than he expected, all fire and air, and now as limp as a rag doll. He mounted Ash in one smooth motion, settling her in front of him, her head lolling against his chest. He turned Ash back toward Silver Range, toward the meager safety of his ranch. He kicked the horse into a steady trot, wanting to put as much distance as possible between them and the carriage. He didn't look back. He rode for 10 minutes before he chanced to glance over his shoulder at the horizon. His stomach dropped. Far in the distance, where the stage road met the sky, a new cloud was rising. It was not a rain cloud. It was a plume of dust, large and moving fast, too large for one rider. It was a posse, the kind of posse a rich family would send, the kind of posse that wouldn't ask questions before shooting. Caleb urged Ash faster. The storm was coming. Caleb pushed Ash harder than the old horse had been pushed in years, the added weight of the unconscious woman a burden on the animal's already thin frame. He didn't dare follow the stage road, instead cutting across his own parched land, using the low, rolling hills and dry arroyos as cover. The plume of dust on the horizon grew larger, splitting into individual riders. A hornet's nest stirred and swarming. He reached the Silver Range Ranch just as the sun bled its last fiery light onto the mountains. The ranch was a skeleton of what it had once been. The main house, built of solid timber by his father's hands, was now bleached a ghostly gray, the paint long since sandblasted away by the incessant wind. The corrals, once brimming with herds that commanded top dollar, now held only Ash. 3 other lame horses, and a half-dozen bony cattle he kept more for sentiment than profit. The great barn stood silent, its wide doors sagging on their hinges. Everything, from the porch rail to the water pump, was covered in a fine, suffocating layer of red Arizona dust. The air smelled of this dust, of dry rot, and of the faint, musty scent of damp hay from a trough that perpetually leaked. He carried her inside, kicking the warped door open with his boot. The cabin was a single large room, starkly furnished but rigorously clean. A cold cast-iron stove dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the middle, and his own bed, a simple frame with a worn, dark blue wool blanket, occupied the far corner. He laid her down on the blanket, her body sinking into the thin mattress. The contrast of her torn, expensive white lace against the drab, functional wool of his bed was stark. He turned to the dry sink, pouring a ladle of water from the bucket into a tin cup, his back to her. She woke as if struck. It was not a gentle return to consciousness. It was a violent expulsion from darkness. She gasped, a raw, sucking sound, and bolted upright, her eyes flying open. They were wild, uncomprehending, taking in the alien room, the dark timbers of the ceiling, the unfamiliar shadows, the broad back of the man standing by the sink. The terror, which had only been held at bay by unconsciousness, flooded back in. Her gaze snapped down to her own body, her hands. The ropes were gone, but the marks were not. Deep, raw, crimson grooves encircled her wrists, the skin broken and weeping. The memory, the crash, the gunshot, Jude's laughter, the endless burning run hit her all at once. Her eyes darted frantically around the dim room, searching for a weapon, for anything. On the small, 3-legged table beside the bed, next to a cloudy kerosene lamp, lay his skinning knife. Her hands shot out. her fingers closing around the worn wooden handle, with a scream that was more animal than human. She launched herself from the bed, the knife held high in a trembling, downward arc, aimed squarely at his back. Caleb had survived the war not by being the fastest draw, but by sensing trouble before it arrived. He heard the gasp of air, the rustle of the blanket, the creak of the bed springs. He didn't turn to face her. He moved sideways, pivoting on his heel. He didn't try to block the knife. He caught her wrist, his calloused, powerful hand clamping down on the raw, rope-burned flesh like a steel trap. She cried out in pain, but her momentum was unstoppable. The force of her lunge, met by his sudden, immovable defense, sent them both crashing to the cabin's wooden floor. They landed hard, tangled together on the old, scratchy blanket he used as a rug. The air was knocked from her lungs in a pained whoosh. The knife skittered across the floorboards, spinning to a halt near the cold stove. She landed half underneath him, his weight pinning her, but the fight was not gone. She was fueled by a terror so profound it blocked out all reason. She twisted, bucking against his weight, her free hand clawing at his face, her legs kicking at his shins. She was a whirlwind of desperate, terrified motion. Caleb didn't hit her. He simply endured, absorbing the blows, his superior weight and strength acting as an anchor. He grabbed her other wrist, pinning both her hands above her head against the floor. "Stop," he commanded, his voice a low, rough growl that vibrated through her. "Stop it." "You are safe," she continued to struggle, twisting her head, sobbing, her body arching against his hold. "I am not him," he said, louder this time, his face close to hers. "I am not them." The words finally cut through the panic. She stopped fighting, her body going limp, and the animalistic rage dissolved, leaving only a woman, broken and sobbing, beneath him. He held her there for a second longer, letting the silence confirm the truce, before he released her wrists and rolled off, rising to his feet in one fluid motion. He retrieved the knife and slid it deliberately into the sheath on his belt, his eyes never leaving her. She scrambled backward across the floor, crab-walking until her back hit the rough-hewn planks of the cabin wall. She pulled her knees up to her chest, trying to make herself small, her shoulders shaking. Caleb sighed, a breath heavy with exhaustion. He went back to the sink, dipped the tin cup into the water bucket, and walked over to her. He set it on the floor, sliding it the last few feet until it rested by her torn dress. She stared at the cup, her breathing ragged, suspecting poison or some trick, but the dust of the desert caked her throat. After a long, tense moment, her hand darted out. She snatched the cup and drank, gulping the lukewarm water, spilling as much as she swallowed down her chin and onto the filthy bodice of her dress. He turned from her, retrieving a small wooden box from a high shelf. He opened it. Inside were a few rolls of clean linen, a bottle of dark whiskey, and some dried herbs. "Your wrists," he said, not as a question, but a statement. She flinched as he knelt in front of her, but she was too exhausted to run. She held out her hands, palms down, trembling. He uncorked the whiskey and poured a small amount onto a square of linen. "This will sting," she hissed, squeezing her eyes shut as the alcohol hit the raw, open wounds. But she did not pull away. He worked with a surprising, detached gentleness. His hands were large and scarred, the hands of a man who worked with rock and rope and rebellious livestock. But his movements were steady as he cleaned the grit from the abrasions and wrapped both wrists in clean white bandages. He tied off the final knot. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of kindness, but also, for the moment, of menace. She swallowed, her throat still raw. "Eliza," she whispered. "Eliza Monroe." She hesitated, as if unsure of the fact. "I am 26 years old." "Monroe," Caleb repeated. The name was nothing to him. "Who were the men chasing you?" My husband's men. And the man in the suit, the one back at the carriage, he was a representative," she said, her gaze dropping to her newly bandaged hands. "From the Western Meridian Railroad line. My father arranged the wedding, to seal an agreement." Must be an important man. Your father, Caleb observed, his voice still flat. To seal his agreements with railroad men and gunmen. Eliza looked up. For the first time, the terror in her eyes receded, replaced by a shadow. Something old and weary and laced with shame. My father, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, is Barrett Kane. The name struck Caleb Rowan with the force of a physical blow. The air in the room thickened, became heavy and hard to breathe. Barrett Kane. It was not just a name in the territory. It was a blight. It was the name whispered by ranchers who found their fences cut and their herds scattered. It was the name cursed by homesteaders who lost their land to legal tax auctions after their wells mysteriously failed. Barrett Kane, the cattle baron who was richer than God and twice as ruthless. The man who was buying up the territory one desperate farmer, one foreclosure and one bullet at a time. The man who controlled the water. Caleb's vision tunneled. He was no longer in his cabin. He was standing on a ridge 4 years ago. The night air cold, watching his family's homestead burn against the black sky. The Rowan homestead. The place his father had built with his own hands. The place his mother had loved. He remembered the roar of the flames, the smell of burning timber and the sickening scent of his cattle, trapped and dying in the barn. He had found his younger brother, Thomas, the next morning, crumpled near the spring that Kane had offered to buy. Thomas, only 19, who had a good heart and a stubborn streak, and who had refused to sell their water. Thomas, who had been shot twice. The sheriff had called it a dispute with unknown drifters. But Caleb knew. The whole territory knew. You did not say no to Barrett Kane. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. His right hand, of its own accord, moved to rest on the butt of the Colt he had retrieved from the desert floor and strapped back on. The air in the small cabin crackled. He was looking at the woman on his floor, but he was seeing the orange flames reflected in his brother's dead eyes, and this was Kane's daughter, the flesh and blood of the man who had destroyed his life. Eliza saw the change instantly. She had lived her whole life reading the moods of a dangerous man. She saw Caleb's face, already hard, transform into something carved from granite. She saw the calculating gray of his eyes turn to ice. You know his name, she whispered, a new, colder fear creeping into her. I know it, Caleb bit out, the words sounding like rocks grinding together. He forced me, Eliza said, the words tumbling out, sensing the new and profound danger she was in. The wedding, it was not my choice. You married Jude Marlowe, Caleb stated. It wasn't a question. He knew of Marlowe. A gunman with a taste for cruelty. Kane's new enforcer, the rabid dog to Kane's cold calculation. Yes, my father. He wanted a partnership, to merge his power with Marlowe's gang. They want to control the new railroad, the supply routes, the beef contracts. All of it. So he sold you to him. Yes, she said, shame and anger flashing in her eyes. To bind them together. But it was a trap. Not just for me. For the railroad man. Mr. Harris. She began to tremble again, reliving it. On the way from the church, in the carriage. Jude and Harris started arguing about the contracts. Harris said the Western Meridian line wouldn't be bullied, and Jude, he just laughed. He pulled his revolver and he shot him. He just shot him, right there. She choked back a sob, forcing the words out. He killed him, and then he pushed me from the carriage, and he told his men to kill the driver and make it look like a robbery. But he told me he was going to frame me. He said a hysterical bride, trapped in a marriage she hated. He said everyone would believe I killed Harris. He was going to use me as a hostage, to blackmail my father, and to force the railroad to deal with him, or he'd hang their representative's murder on me. I swear to you, she pleaded, seeing the unmoving hatred in his face. I had no part in it. I had no part in any of my father's crimes. She looked at the floorboards, her voice dropping but hardening with a sudden, bitter resolve. I told my father, when he said I had to marry Jude, I told him directly, I'd rather die than be yours. I meant yours, as in my father's property. His pawn. She looked up. her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But he just laughed. He told me women don't get to choose in this part of the country." Caleb stood perfectly still, his world tilting. The irony was so bitter it burned his throat. He had saved his mortal enemy's daughter, a tool, a weapon. She was leverage. His mind, the old cavalryman's mind, raced through the tactical possibilities. He could hand her over to the sheriff, but Sheriff Duffy was in Kane's pocket. He could send word to Marlowe, but Marlowe would just kill him and take her. Or he could send word to Barrett Kane. He could trade the girl. Trade her for the water rights to the spring Thomas died for. Trade her for blood money. Trade her for revenge. Before him sat the daughter, perhaps innocent of this day's work, but she was the fruit of a poisoned tree. And just outside, over the rise, under a pile of stones, lay his brother. The cold, 4-year-old rage screamed at him. This was his chance to make Barrett Kane feel the loss of family. Eliza watched him. She saw the calculation click into place behind his cold eyes. She saw the deep, settled hatred he held for her name, and she saw the dawning, dangerous realization of her value. She saw, with chilling clarity, that she had not been rescued. She had only changed hands. Her fear evaporated, replaced by the same cold, desperate clarity she'd felt on the road. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer pleading. It was low, steady, and sharp as a razor. "He will kill you," she said. Caleb's gaze snapped back to her. "If you are thinking of trading me," she continued, her eyes locked with his, "of bartering me back to my father, Jude will kill you. He will kill you for taking me. He will kill you for even looking at me. And if you hand me to him, he will kill you for knowing what he did to that railroad man." She took a shaky breath, pressing the advantage. "He will burn this ranch to the ground, with you in it, just like my father burned yours." Caleb's hand tensed on his gun. "What did you say?" "I know what he does," she whispered, her face pale but her gaze unwavering. "I hear the talk. I know about the fires. I know about the ranchers who disappear. I am not a fool, Mr. Rowan." She had seen the name Rowan carved into the porch rail when he carried her in. "If you return me to them, Jude Marlowe will kill you. And then," her voice finally broke, "he will kill me, and he will kill everyone who ever touched me." She had laid the truth bare. She was caught between two vows of hatred. And now, Caleb realized, so was he. The silence in the cabin stretched, becoming as taut as a bowstring. Eliza's last words hung in the dusty air, a cold, hard statement of fact that pierced Caleb's rage. She was right. Jude Marlowe was a rabid dog, and Barrett Kane was the disease. Handing her back to either of them was a death sentence. Not just for her, but for him. The revenge he craved would die with him in the ashes of his ranch. Caleb broke the stare, turning his back on her to walk to the cold stove. He picked up a small piece of kindling, weighing it in his hand as he weighed his options. The old, pure hatred for Kane was still there, a hot coal in his gut. But the cavalryman, the tactician, was taking over. This woman, this daughter of his enemy, was not a pawn to be traded. She was a weapon that had just fallen into his lap. "All right," he said, his voice low, still facing the stove. He turned around slowly. His face was a mask of cold control. The fire was gone from his eyes, replaced by the flat gray of calculation. "Here is the bargain, a cold one. So you listen hard." Eliza watched him, her hands clasped so tightly her bandaged wrists ached. "I will not hand you over to Jude Marlowe. I will not send word to your father." He took a step toward her. "In return, you will empty your head onto that table. Everything you know, every ledger book you've seen, every backroom deal you've overheard, the names of the men your father uses to buy his sheriffs, the routes his money takes, the details of these accidents on the railroad. You will tell me how he is stealing this valley, piece by piece." He stopped a few feet from her. "You are Barrett Kane's daughter. You've lived in the heart of his business. You will give me the ammunition I need to tear it down. You give me that, and I will keep you alive. You try to run. You hold back even one detail, and I will give you to Marlowe myself. Do you understand the terms? Eliza stared at him, her body still trembling, but a new, defiant anger was rising, burning through the fear. He was no savior. He was just another man trying to use her, just like her father, just like Jude. But his bargain, as cold as it was, offered something the others did not, a target for her own hatred. Yes, she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. I understand. She pushed herself to her feet, using the wall for support. And I accept, but not just to save my own skin. Her eyes flashed, and Caleb saw the same defiant fire he'd seen on the desert road. I hate him, she whispered, and for a second Caleb thought she meant her father. I hate Jude Marlowe. She walked unsteadily to the table, gripping its edge. About 6 months ago, at my father's house, Jude, he had been drinking all day. He cornered me in the stable. He was talking, telling me what he wanted. A young boy, a stable hand named Peter. Only 15, he tried to step between us. He told Jude to leave me be. Eliza's voice cracked, and she squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back the memory. Jude was drunk. He was angry that a boy would dare. She took a ragged breath, her body shaking. He killed him, with the butt of his pistol, for getting in his way. And my father covered it up, said the boy was kicked by a horse. She opened her eyes, and they were filled with a raw self-loathing. I have not had a full night's sleep since that day, so, yes, Mr. Rowan, I will tell you everything I know. I will help you rake his whole world over the coals. The shared hatred, aimed at different targets but stemming from the same poisonous root, settled between them. It was not trust. It was an alliance, forged in blood and desperation. The sun had long set, and the cabin was deep in shadow. The tension was still thick enough to choke on, but the practical needs of life were pressing. Caleb lit the kerosene lamp, and the small, flickering flame pushed the darkness back into the corners, casting long, trembling shadows. The light caught the exhaustion on Eliza's face, the deep purple bruises under her eyes, the dried blood on her torn dress. Caleb turned to the rough-planked pantry. You're hungry, he stated. He pulled out a heavy black skillet, a slab of salt bacon, and a can of beans. It was the food of a man who ate to survive, not to enjoy. He moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, slicing the bacon and dropping it into the skillet. The sharp sizzle and the sudden smell of frying meat filled the small cabin. It was an intimate, domestic sound that felt shockingly out of place after the violence of the day. Eliza sat at the small table, her hands in her lap, watching him. He was a large man, and his movements in the confined space seemed to make the room shrink. He never fully turned his back on her, even when tending the fire. He spooned the beans into a pair of tin plates, adding the crisp bacon beside them, and set one plate in front of her with a fork. He sat opposite, his own Winchester rifle leaning against the wall, just within his reach. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the scraping of forks on tin. The food was simple, salty, and hot, and Eliza realized she was starving, her body desperate for fuel. Tell me about the water, Caleb said, his voice breaking the silence. He wasn't looking at her, but at his plate. The land he took from the Millers, up north by the Cienega. Eliza swallowed. The Millers? Yes. I remember my father and Jude laughing about that. They said the Miller well was deep, the last good water in that valley. My father's lawyers found an old Spanish land grant, a piece of paper from 100 years ago. They said the Millers' deed was worthless. When the Millers refused to leave, their barn burned down. I knew the Millers, Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. They have 4 children. They left with 1 wagon and a lame mule. Eliza flinched, pushing the last of her beans around the plate. I knew it was wrong, but I was in his house. What could I do? Nothing, Caleb said, but there was no forgiveness in his tone. What else? She began to talk. She spoke of the opulence of her father's dinners, held in a dining room with glass windows that had been hauled all the way from St. Louis, while the rest of the territory starved. She described the men who came to those dinners: railroad men in fine suits, politicians from Prescott, army captains, and men like Jude Marlowe, whose only suit was their gun belt. She told him how her father would sit at the head of the table, smiling, as he moved land deeds and cattle contracts around like pieces on a chessboard. Caleb listened, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He, in turn, told her what those chessboard moves meant on the ground. He told her about the ranchers, like him, who were being choked out, their water access cut off, their cattle starving. He spoke of the homesteaders driven from their land and the miners whose claims were jumped by Marlowe's men. As they spoke, a strange and terrible understanding bloomed between them. Eliza, who had lived her life surrounded by the mechanisms of her father's empire, finally saw the blood and the tears that oiled the gears. She saw that the monster the territory whispered about was not a stranger. It was her family. And Caleb, who had seen her as nothing but a piece of her father's evil, began to see something else. He saw a woman who had lived in a gilded cage, her eyes wide open, forced to watch the horrors her father committed, but powerless to stop any of it. She was as much a victim of Barrett Kane as the Millers, just in a different, more complicated way. The meal ended, the tension remained, but its character had changed. It was no longer the simple, sharp fear of a captive and a captor. It was something more complex, a shared space of two people who understood each other's worlds too well. Eliza stood to take her plate to the dry sink. As she passed him, she noticed something she had missed. The sleeve of his dark blue shirt, near the shoulder, was stained, a dark, wet patch. "You're hurt," she said, stopping. Caleb glanced at his arm. Surprised, he'd forgotten. It was a shallow graze from the first rider he'd shot, the one who had fired back. Or maybe he'd torn it on a rock. He'd barely felt it. "It's nothing. It's bleeding through," she insisted. She pointed to his kerchief, which was tied around his neck. "Let me see. I learned to dress wounds. My mother—" She trailed off. Caleb hesitated. To let her touch him, to accept help, felt like a concession, a breach in the wall he kept around himself, but he also knew that a wound left to fester in the desert was a death sentence. Grudgingly, he untied the kerchief and pulled up his sleeve. The graze was shallow but long, oozing dark blood. It was caked with red dust. Eliza took the kerchief, dipped a corner of it in the precious water from the bucket, and gently began to clean the wound. Caleb sat rigid on the bench, his muscles tensed, watching her. Her touch was light, surprisingly steady. She cleaned the grit from the wound, her movements careful and practiced. "It's not deep," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "But it's dirty." As she dabbed at the skin above the graze, her fingers brushed against something else, a puckered white line that ran from his shoulder almost to his collarbone, an old scar, pale against his sun-darkened skin. It was slick and smooth, the mark of a serious blade, long-heeled, a saber cut. Her fingers paused, resting on the scar for just a fraction of a second. In that instant, the air in the cabin stopped moving. Caleb went absolutely still. Her touch was not a threat, but it was a connection. It was the first time in years he had allowed himself to be vulnerable, even in this small way. He could feel the warmth of her hand through the thin fabric of his shirt, a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat of the day. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She was touching this hard, dangerous man, and in this scar, she felt his entire, violent past. She was suddenly aware of his proximity, the smell of him, sweat, dust, and the faint, metallic scent of his gun oil. They were no longer two enemies at a table. They were a man and a woman, alone in a small room, bound by violence and a shared secret. Caleb broke the moment. He pulled his arm back sharply, as if her touch had burned him. "It's fine," he said, his voice harsh. He stood up abruptly, pulling his sleeve down. The wall was back up, higher and thicker than before. "It's done!" Eliza recoiled, pulling her hand back as if she touched a hot stove. She stood, flustered, holding the bloody kerchief. "The bed is yours," he said, gesturing to the corner. His tone was cold, all business again. Where will you sleep?" "By the door." He picked up his rifle and the worn wool blanket from the floor and dropped them near the cabin's single entrance. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and laid the Winchester across his lap. He clicked the hammer back to half-cock. The sound was loud in the small space. Eliza understood. He was protecting the cabin from the men who were hunting her, but he was also guarding her, his prisoner, in case she decided to run. He was her protector and her jailer, all in one. She retreated to the bed, but she did not undress. She lay down on top of the old blue blanket, her body aching, her mind racing. The cabin was dark, save for the sliver of moonlight forcing its way through the single, grimy window. She could hear every sound, the mournful whistle of the wind as it whistled through the cracks in the cabin walls, the distant, lonely yip of a coyote, and, closer, the sound of Caleb's breathing, slow and steady, but not the sound of a man who was truly asleep. She heard him shift his weight on the hard floor, the soft rasp of his clothes against the wood. She lay there for hours, her eyes wide open in the dark, her heart pounding a heavy, confused rhythm. She had run from a man she hated, only to be captured by a man who hated her, and yet the memory of her fingers on his scar, the sudden, sharp intake of his breath, the shared moment of understanding over a plate of beans, it terrified her more than Marlowe's bullets. She turned her face into the thin, rough pillow, which smelled faintly of him of soap and old leather. "I'd rather die than be yours," she whispered again, so softly the wind swallowed the words. But this time, the vow was not for her father, or for Jude. This time, it was a desperate plea against her own heart. Outside, far in the distance, on the black ridge that marked the edge of Kane's territory, a single spark of orange light flared to life. It was too steady to be a lightning strike, too bright to be a star. It was a signal fire, a watcher, on the hill. The net was closing. Caleb did not sleep. He sat by the door, the Winchester heavy across his knees, and listened to the desert. He listened to the wind, to the skitter of a pack rat under the floorboards, and to the woman's restless, shallow breathing from his bed. Each sound was a potential threat. The signal fire on the ridge had burned for an hour, a single, malevolent eye in the darkness, and then it had vanished, which was worse. It meant the watcher was on the move, before the sky had even begun to pale from black to gray. He was up. He moved silently, his boots in his hand until he was outside. He slipped them on and walked, not to the porch, but in a wide circle around his property, his eyes on the ground. The dust, as always, told the story. He found the tracks near the well, the one he'd checked just the day before. 3 horses. They had come in the night, walking slow, and had stood for a long time by the trough. They had not been thirsty. They had been waiting, watching the cabin. He followed the tracks to a low rise 100 yards south. Here, they had dismounted. He found 3 fresh piles of horse droppings, and something else, a spent brass shell casing, glinting in the faint pre-dawn light. A .45 caliber, from a rifle. Someone had been lying prone, watching his front door through a rifle sight. Then he found the most damning sign of all. Ground into the dust was the stub of a cigar, a thick, expensive brand from Havana, the kind that cost more than a week's worth of feed. It had been smoked halfway down and discarded with careless arrogance. Only Barrett Kane's inner circle, or Jude Marlowe himself, smoked that brand. They knew he had her. They had been close enough to kill him in his sleep. They were toying with him, or, more likely, waiting for their leader to arrive. He walked back to the cabin, the cold knot in his gut tightening into something solid and heavy. He kicked the door open. The sound made Eliza jolt upright in the bed, her hand flying to her throat, her eyes wide with terror. "Get up," he said, his voice a low growl. He tossed her the worn canvas duster he kept by the door. "Put this on. Now. What is it? What's wrong?" "They're here, or they're coming. They were watching us all night." He didn't wait for her to dress. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip hard and impersonal, and pulled her from the bed. He dragged her out the back door, across the small, dusty yard, toward the dilapidated cattle pens. "Where are you taking me?" she panted, stumbling to keep up, her torn dress catching on the rough ground. He didn't answer until he had shoved her behind the safest place. He had a low, thick stone wall that formed the back of the empty cattle trough. It was solid, offered a good field of fire toward the house, and was low enough to shoot over. He pushed his own Winchester rifle into her hands. The weapon was heavy, the wood smooth, the metal cold. "You said you could shoot," he snarled. "You're about to prove it." I used a shotgun. Once, yesterday." "This is not a shotgun." His hands were on hers, forcing them into place. "This is the lever. You pull it down, then up. It puts a bullet in the chamber. This is the trigger. You don't touch it until you are ready to kill something. This is the sight. You put the man you want to kill behind it." His lesson was brutal and fast, delivered in a clipped, angry monotone. He was terrified, and it was coming out as rage. He pushed a box of cartridges into her lap. "You load it like this. You feed them into the gate. You can put 7 in. Do it now." Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped the first bullet in the dust. I can't." He grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. His gray eyes were like chips of ice, but deep behind them, she saw a flicker of that same desperate fear she felt. "They are coming to kill me and to take you. They will not be gentle. You will do this, or you will die here." He made her load the rifle, his hand over hers, forcing the shells into the gate, one by one. The metallic click, click, click was the only sound in the yard. "Now," he said. Standing up, he handed her his spare revolver, the one he kept in his saddlebag. "This is a .44. It's simpler. You pull the hammer, you pull the trigger. It's loud, and it kicks. It is for when they are close." He backed away from her. "The rifle shot is a sharp crack. The shotgun I'm carrying is a deep boom. You stay behind this wall. You don't fire. You don't move. You don't even breathe. But if they get past me, if they get to that front door," he jerked his chin toward the cabin, "you will fire the first shot. You shoot the first man who steps inside. Do you understand me?" "Caleb," she whispered, her face pale. "I'm scared." "Good," he said, his voice cold, but his eyes betrayed him. They were full of a terrible, aching worry. "Stay scared. It'll keep you low." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone behind the wall, a heavy rifle in her lap, and the smell of cigar smoke on the air. He went to the porch of the main house. He did not go inside. He pulled a chair into the shade, sat down, and laid his sawed-off shotgun across his lap. And he waited. 2 hours passed. The sun climbed, and the heat began to build. The only sound was the buzz of a few lazy flies. Then he saw them. 3 riders, coming not from the road, but from the south, from the rise where he'd found the cigar stub. They rode slow, not in a hurry, their hands in plain sight. This was not an attack. This was a parley, which was worse. They stopped 30 yards from his porch, a respectable, cautious distance. The man in the middle was Conrad Hales. Caleb knew him by reputation, a famous manhunter. Hales wore a long, dusty gray coat despite the heat, and a battered hat that shadowed his face. He was a man who brought in his bounties cold more often than warm. A tarnished, scratched bounty hunter's badge was pinned to his coat. It meant he was operating with the color of law, which made him twice as dangerous. "Rowan!" Hales called out. His voice was like gravel rolling in a dry creek bed. Caleb said nothing. He just sat, the shotgun balanced on his thighs. "We know you have her," Hales continued, patting his horse's neck. "We tracked her from the crash. "We're not here for you, Rowan. We don't want to fight with you." "That's so," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. Hales reached inside his duster. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it up. "This is an official warrant from the marshal's office in Prescott for the arrest of one Eliza Monroe, or Kane, I suppose, for the murder of a railroad representative yesterday." Hales let that sink in. Then he reached into another pocket and pulled out a second, thicker piece of paper. "And this is a personal matter, a reward. From Barrett Kane. $1,000, in gold, for the safe return of his daughter. He's concerned for her safety." Hales smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. "He wants her back. He'll pay for the trouble. And the law wants her for murder. You're harboring a wanted fugitive. Rowan." He nudged his horse a step closer. "Just give her to us. We'll take the girl, you take the money, and we all walk away. You can buy a lot of water for $1,000. Behind the cattle trough, Eliza had crept to a small crack between the stones. She could not hear all the words, only the rumble of Hales's voice and the promise of gold and $1,000. She saw Hales hold up the papers. She saw Caleb do nothing. He just sat there. His head was bowed slightly, as if he were studying the planks of his porch. His hand, the one not holding the shotgun, was resting on his thigh, near the Colt at his hip. She watched, her heart turning to stone, as his fingers slowly clenched. He gripped the worn handle of his revolver, his knuckles turning white. Caleb Rowan froze. The sun beat down on the yard. The flies buzzed. This was it. This was the offer from the devil, and it was a good one. $1,000. It was more money than he'd seen in 5 years. It was enough to pay off his note at the bank. It was enough to buy feed, to hire men, to drill a new well. It was enough to fight Barrett Kane. All he had to do was trade the man's daughter, a woman who, by Hales's account, was a murderer anyway. He saw Thomas's grave, clear as day, on the hill behind the house. This was revenge. It was justice. Giving Kane's daughter to the law he himself had bought. It was a perfect, terrible poetry. He could have his revenge and be rich for it. Eliza saw the terrible, agonizing stillness. She saw his hand, white-knuckled on his gun. He was weighing her life against his ranch, against his thirst, against his own brother's blood. And she knew, with a sickening certainty, which way the scales would tip. He was going to sell her. Caleb let out a breath, slow and quiet. He lifted his head. He took his white-knuckled hand off his gun, and he deliberately, slowly, set the shotgun on the porch beside his chair. He stood up. He did not look at Hales. He turned his back on the 3 armed men. A gesture of such profound contempt, it was louder than a gunshot. He stepped off the porch. He walked to the center of the yard, right into the line of fire. He stopped and looked at the ground. He saw the wanted poster Hales had dropped. He stared at it for a long second, then set his boot on it, grinding it into the red dust. Then he looked up at Conrad Hales. He walked forward, slow and deliberate, right up to Hales's horse. The 2 men beside Hales shifted, their hands moving to their guns. But Hales held up a hand. His eyes narrowed, confused. Caleb stopped when his knee was almost touching Hales's stirrup. He looked up at the mounted, armed bounty hunter. With a movement so fast Hales didn't even see it, Caleb's hand shot out. He didn't go for a gun. He grabbed the tarnished badge on Hales's chest, ripped it from the coat with a sound of tearing cloth, and held it up. "This," Caleb said, his voice quiet, "is bought and paid for. It's as worthless as he is." He threw the badge into the dust. "The only one guilty here," Caleb said, his voice rising, clear and carrying to Eliza behind the wall, "is Barrett Kane. You take one more step, we talk with lead." It all happened at once. Hales roared in outrage and yanked his revolver from its holster, but Caleb was already moving, diving backward as he drew his own Colt. The yard exploded in gunfire. Hales's shot went wild, kicking up splinters from the porch where Caleb had been a second before. Caleb, rolling in the dust, fired from the ground. His shot was not aimed to kill, it was aimed to maim. The bullet struck Hales's right hand, shattering the bone, sending his revolver spinning into the air. Hales screamed. A high, thin sound, clutching his ruined hand to his chest. The man on Hales's left spurred his horse, trying to get a clear shot at the man on the ground. The man on the right, the smarter one, didn't charge. He wheeled his horse, spurring it hard toward the side of the ranch, toward the cattle pens. He was going to flank Caleb. He was going to come up behind him. Eliza saw him coming. He was a dark shape, galloping hard, his rifle out. He wasn't going to the front door. He was going to get behind Caleb. He was breaking the rule Caleb had given her. She heard Caleb's pistol crack again, driving the second man back. The flanker was almost to the wall. He raised his rifle. Eliza screamed. She lifted the heavy Winchester, braced it on the stone wall, closed her eyes, and pulled the trigger. The boom of the rifle was deafening, a physical blow that slammed her back against the dirt. The recoil was so strong it knocked the rifle from her hands and sent a searing pain through her shoulder. She fell back, shaking, her ears ringing, smoke stinging her eyes. She had no idea if she'd hit him. Caleb heard the shot, the unfamiliar sound of his rifle. From behind him, he rolled, bringing his Colt up, expecting to see the flanker riding down on him. But the flanker was not on his horse. The horse was galloping away. Stirrups flying, the man was on the ground, 10 yards from Eliza's wall. Not moving. "Get out!" Hales was screaming at his remaining man. Cradling his bloody hand, he wheeled his horse and dug in his spurs, racing away. The second man right behind him. They disappeared back over the southern rise, leaving a cloud of dust and 2 bodies in their wake. The silence that fell was absolute. It was a dead, ringing quiet. Caleb got to his feet, breathing hard, his Colt still smoking in his hand. He looked at the man Eliza had shot. He looked at the man he had shot near the road yesterday. He looked at his ranch. He stalked over to the wall. Eliza was huddled on the ground, shaking so violently she couldn't stand. Her eyes were squeezed shut, and she was sobbing, gasping for air. Caleb looked at her, then at the man she'd killed. He opened his mouth to say something to thank her, to yell at her. He didn't know which, but Hales's voice, thin and full of venom, drifted back over the ridge. "This isn't over. Rowan Barrett will burn this place to get his daughter back, and Jude will take your head first." The words hung in the hot, still air. The ranch was no longer just a struggling property. It was a target. Caleb looked at Eliza, who was still weeping in the dust. He had made his choice. He had thrown away his one chance at easy revenge and $1,000. All for her. He put his gun back in its holster. "Get up," he said, his voice rougher than ever. "They'll be back, and they'll be bringing hell with them." The bodies lay in the yard for less than an hour. Caleb couldn't risk leaving them as a beacon. He and Eliza, in a grim, silent partnership, dragged the 2 men into the dry arroyo behind the barn and covered them with rocks. The work was hard. The sun was brutal, and the finality of it settled on them like a shroud. The man Eliza had shot was young, barely 20. She was sick behind the stone wall when it was done, but Caleb offered no comfort. There was no time. Hale's threat echoed in the hot, still air. "Barrett will burn this place. Jude will take your head." They were no longer defending a ranch. They were sitting inside their own coffin, waiting for the nails. "We can't stay here," Caleb said, his voice flat. He was cleaning his Colt at the kitchen table, his movements precise, mechanical. "They won't send 3 men next time. They'll send 30. They'll come with torches and rifles, and they'll have the law on their side." Eliza was huddled by the cold stove, her face pale and streaked with dust and dried sweat. She was still wearing the ruined wedding dress. "Where can we go the desert?" "No," Caleb said. "You can't outrun a posse in this territory, and you can't fight an army, not from here." He snapped the cylinder of his revolver shut. "We're going into town. We're going to Sable Cross." "Town." She looked at him as if he were mad. "They'll be looking for me. That man, Hales, he had a warrant. He said I was a murderer." He had a piece of paper bought by your father, Caleb retorted. But the town is the only chance we have. Hiding here is suicide. We need to see who's still standing on their own 2 feet, and who's already on Cain's payroll. He stood and grabbed his skinning knife from the table. He walked over to her. Eliza flinched, pressing back against the wall. He didn't stop. He knelt and grabbed the torn, filthy hem of her wedding dress. "This," he said, "is a target." He began to saw at the expensive fabric, cutting it off just below her knees. The lace and silk parted with a rough, tearing sound. He cut away the puffed sleeves, leaving the bodice bare. "What are you doing?" she gasped, horrified. "Saving your life." He finished the crude alteration and stood, throwing the scraps of white fabric into the stove. He grabbed the canvas duster he'd given her earlier and threw it at her. "Put this on, and this." He went to his own trunk and pulled out an old, sweat-stained felt hat, the brim wide and floppy. "Keep your head down, and keep this hat pulled low. You're not a bride anymore. You're just another drifter. You don't talk. You don't look at anyone. You just walk where I tell you. Understand?" She nodded, her hands trembling as she pulled on the heavy duster, the sleeves ridiculously long, the shoulders impossibly broad. It swallowed her, masking her shape, and it smelled of him of dust, and horse, and gunpowder. She put on the hat, and her face disappeared in its shadow. They rode ash double, Caleb in the saddle and Eliza riding behind him, her arms locked around his waist. It was a terrible risk, but it was their only horse with any stamina. Every time her hands brushed the hard muscle of his back, she flinched, and every time she tightened her grip, he went rigid. They were 2 enemies, bound together by necessity, their proximity a constant, agonizing reminder of the line that separated them. They arrived in Sable Cross as the afternoon heat was at its peak. The town was exactly as he'd described it, a collection of sun-scorched wooden buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast, empty desert. The main street was a wide ribbon of ankle-deep red dust. A few heat-stunned horses were tied to hitching rails, their heads hanging low, their tails switching lazily at flies. It was a town living on borrowed time. The saloon, the Gilded Cage, had a piano that was playing a tinny, out-of-tune waltz to an audience of 3 listless cowboys. The church was a gray, wooden box with a leaning steeple, its paint peeled away by the wind, and the sheriff's office was a tiny, single-room shack pressed between the blacksmith and the assayer's office. But the real heart of the town, the place that told the true story, was the courthouse, nailed to a big wooden board out front, fluttering in the hot breeze, were the notices, dozens of them, foreclosure auctions, notices of seizure for non-payment, and on every single one, the reason was the same: delinquency on contracted water tax. It was Barrett Cain's signature, written in legal ink. He was bleeding the valley dry, 1 piece of paper at a time. Caleb dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, and Eliza slid down, her legs shaking. He kept a hand on her arm, his grip firm, guiding her as if she were his property, a detail of the disguise that made her stomach churn. He pushed the door open. The office was small, cramped, and smelled of stale coffee, cheap cigar smoke, and dust. A single desk was covered in stacks of paper. A rifle rack on the wall held 3 Winchesters. In the corner, 2 small cells sat empty. Behind the desk sat Sheriff Nora Duffy. She was a woman in her late 40s, her hair a mix of steel gray and black, pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was lined by the sun and by worry, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. She had been the wife of a miner who died in a shaft collapse, and she had taken his badge, the town figuring she was too stubborn to be bribed and too tough to be scared. So far, they had been right on the second count. She looked up when Caleb entered, her hand not moving from the piece of paper she was reading. She recognized Caleb instantly. "Rowan," she said, her voice dry as the dust outside. "Didn't expect to see you in town, especially not today." Her eyes flickered to the small, hat-shadowed figure standing behind him. "Who's your friend?" "A problem," Caleb said, shutting the door. He guided Eliza to a chair, pushed the hat back just enough so Nora could see her face. Nora Duffy's eyes widened, just for a second. She recognized the face from the one and only society picture that had run in the Prescott paper, the Kane girl. She looked back at Caleb, her expression hardening. "You're a damn fool. Do you know what you've walked into?" "I've got a good idea," Caleb said. "Just got paid a visit by Conrad Hales." Nora winced, as if from a physical pain. "Hales? Then it's already started." She leaned back in her chair, the old wood creaking in protest. "He came through here this morning, flashed a warrant, signed by a federal judge. For her," she nodded at Eliza, "for the murder of the railroad man. And he had a personal wire from Barrett Kane, offering a substantial reward for her retrieval." "The warrant's a lie," Eliza said, her voice quiet but clear. "Jude Marlowe killed him. I saw it." "I believe you," Nora said, surprising them both. "But the law doesn't, or rather, the law in this town doesn't care. Barrett Kane owns the judge. He owns the mayor, and he owns the entire town council. They've all got Kane's water running to their properties while the rest of the valley dries up and blows away. So you can't help us," Caleb said. It was a statement, not a question. "I can't arrest your way out of this. Rowan," Nora said, her voice low and angry. "I'm one woman with one badge, and Jude Marlowe, he's the other side of Kane's coin. Kane buys the law, and Jude provides the security. He and his men cleared out the Apache Canyon gang last month, saved 2 stagecoaches. The council loves him for it. In exchange, all he asks is that the town looks the other way when accidents happen, like the one that's about to happen to you." A cold silence filled the room. "We need allies." "Nora," Caleb said, "we need to find who he doesn't own." Nora gave a short, bitter laugh. "The list is short. It's me, and maybe old May, over at the saloon. The rest are either bought or too terrified to spit." "We need to know what they're planning," Caleb said. "Hales won't be back alone." Nora looked at Eliza's disguise. "That's a risk, but you're right. The Gilded Cage is where Marlowe's men do their drinking. You might hear something." She leaned forward. "But you, girl, you keep your head down. If they recognize you, you'll be dead before you hit the floor. And Caleb right alongside you." The Gilded Cage was louder now, the westering sun driving more men inside. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, stale beer, and cheap whiskey. Caleb guided Eliza to a dark table in the far corner, his hand still on her arm. He ordered a whiskey, his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the room. Eliza kept her hat low, staring at the scarred, wet wood of the table. She felt the eyes of the men in the room, and for the first time in her life, she was not an object of admiration, but of suspicion. Then she heard them, a group of 4 cowboys, loud and drunk, at a table near the bar. They wore the brand of her father's ranch. $1,000, one of them slurred, slamming his glass down. Hales gets his hand shot off, and the boss still ups the reward. "Don't matter," another one laughed. "Jude's got a better plan. He's not gonna wait. He's wiring Prescott now, telling the marshal that this rancher, Rowan, has gone loco. Kidnapped the boss's daughter, murdered 2 of Hales's deputies in cold blood." "That's right," the first one cackled. "He's forming a posse, a legal posse, to go rescue the poor, grieving bride. And if Rowan gets killed resisting, well, that's just justice. And the Silver Range Ranch, it just becomes part of the Kane holdings to cover the damages." Eliza's blood ran cold. They weren't just going to kill him. They were going to use her as the legal excuse to steal his land. "Something to eat, mister." Eliza's head snapped up. An old woman stood over their table, holding a dirty rag. She was thin as a rail, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, but her eyes were as sharp as Nora Duffy's. It was May. "Just the whiskey," Caleb said, his voice tense. But May wasn't looking at him. She was staring at Eliza, her gaze lingering on the delicate line of her jaw, the only part of her face visible under the hat. May's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in recognition. Eliza's heart stopped. She could feel the woman's gaze like a physical touch. May's expression didn't change. She just nodded. "Whiskey. And some water. You," she said, her voice raspy. "Look like you're dying of thirst." She returned a minute later with the water. As she set it down, she accidentally spilled it, the glass tipping and water splashing all over Eliza's lap. "Oh, Lord's sakes, child," May clucked, dabbing at Eliza's duster with the rag. "Clumsy old me. Come on back to the kitchen. Let's get you dried off before you catch a chill." It was not a request. Eliza looked at Caleb, panic in her eyes. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He couldn't blow their cover. Eliza stood and followed the old woman through a set of swinging doors into the hot, chaotic kitchen. The second the doors swung shut, May's grip on her arm became iron. She pulled Eliza into a dark, narrow pantry filled with sacks of flour and the smell of dried herbs. "I knew it was you," May whispered, her voice fierce. "I recognized your hands. They're your mother's hands." "Please," Eliza whispered, backing against the flour sacks. "Don't." "Don't what?" May hissed. "Turn you in, girl. I worked in your father's kitchen for near 10 years. One winter, back in 78, my own boy was sick. Consumption. Your father was going to turn us out. Said he didn't want sickness in the house. But your mother, she hid us in an old line shack. Brought us food and blankets herself. Every day, in a blizzard. She saved my boy's life." May leaned in, her eyes hard. "I owe her, which means I owe you. And I'm telling you, as someone who owes your mother, you need to run. You need to get out of this territory, out of Arizona. Your father, he's not just a hard man anymore. Eliza, he's a monster, and he's using you as his prize pig. You run, and you don't ever look back." When Eliza returned to the table, her face was even paler. She sat down, her hands shaking. "We have to go," she whispered to Caleb. "Now." She told him what the men had said, and what May had warned. They left the saloon and walked back into the blinding sun, the pieces clicking into place. It was a perfect trap. They returned to Nora's office. The sheriff listened, her face grim. "So, that's it," she said. "Jude raises a legal posse to rescue you. He murders Caleb, takes the ranch, and drags you back to your father. And the law will sign off on all of it, neat and tidy." "There has to be something," Caleb said, his voice a low growl of frustration. "Something we can do." Nora was silent for a long time, staring at the warrant on her desk. "Hale's warrant is for Eliza," she said, thinking aloud. "For killing Harris, the railroad man. You—" She looked at Eliza. "Say Jude did it." "Yes, but Barrett covered it up, and he's using it to frame you." "It seems so." "Then this whole thing," Nora said, her eyes lighting with a dangerous, desperate idea. "It all hinges on the railroad. Barrett and Jude want to control it. They murdered a man to do it. If you could find proof, not just that Jude pulled the trigger, but that Barrett Kane ordered it. Something solid. A letter, a ledger. Something that ties your father directly to the murder of that railroad man." "What?" Caleb asked. "What would you do?" Nora Duffy stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the dusty, dying town. "Jude's posse will be made of his own men and a few drunk fools, but there are other people in this valley. People like the Millers. People who've lost everything to Kane. They're scared, but they're not broken. If you bring me that kind of proof that can't be argued away, I will pin this badge to a summons. I will deputize every rancher Kane has ever cheated, and I will form a jury of every citizen who still has a spine. We'll stop fighting his law, and we'll show him what justice looks like. We'll try him ourselves." It was a crazy, desperate, impossible plan. It meant going to war against the most powerful man in the territory, with only a handful of broken farmers. Eliza looked at Caleb, the man who had every reason to kill her. She looked at Nora, the sheriff with no power, and she thought of May, the old woman repaying a decades-old kindness for the first time in her life. She saw a path that wasn't about running or about being sold. It was about fighting back. "Jude's plan," she said, her voice shaking but gaining a new, cold strength. "He's painting me as the grieving bride, the victim. What if we use that what if the victim testifies?" She was no longer just the daughter of Barrett Kane. She was the witness to his downfall. They left Nora Duffy's office with a plan that felt more like a death warrant. The air in Sable Cross had grown heavy, the sky in the west turning a bruised, sickly yellow. A stillness settled over the town, the kind that comes before violence. The wind died, and the dust settled. Waiting, they rode Ash out of town, not toward the ranch, but southwest, toward the Badlands, taking a long, looping path back to Silver Range. Caleb was pushing the old horse, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines around them. Eliza rode behind him, her arms locked around his waist, her face pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt. Her grip was no longer hesitant. It was the desperate hold of someone who had tied her fate to his. Then the sky broke open. It did not begin with a gentle sprinkle. It was a deluge, as if a celestial dam had burst. The first drops were as large as silver dollars, striking the parched earth with audible thwacks, kicking up tiny plumes of red dust. A second later, the world vanished behind a solid, driving wall of water. The sound was a deafening roar. The wind, which had been absent, now howled, driving the rain sideways in cold, stinging sheets. Within a minute, they were soaked to the bone. The canvas duster Eliza wore became a leaden weight, and Caleb's clothes were plastered to his skin, the water finding the still healing graze on his arm and making it sting. The red dust of the desert, which had covered everything for 2 years, turned instantly to a thick, treacherous, scarlet-colored mud. Ash stumbled, his hooves sucking at the greedy ground. "We can't make it to the ranch," Caleb shouted over the roar of the storm. "The arroyos will be flooding." He pulled the horse's head, turning off the trail and urging the struggling animal toward a dark line of mesas that offered the only break in the landscape. He knew this land. He knew its dangers and its few, meager sanctuaries. Tucked into a fold in the rock, almost invisible until you were upon it, was a small, derelict structure, an old miner's shack, abandoned decades ago. He slid from the saddle and pulled Eliza down after him. They staggered through the mud, half blinded by the rain, and Caleb kicked the rotted, sagging door open. They fell inside, gasping, as the storm raged behind them. The shack was tiny, not much bigger than a grave. It smelled of rat droppings, old rust, and the deep, profound scent of damp earth that had finally received water. In one corner, a rusted, pot-bellied stove stood cold. In the other, a wooden cot had collapsed under the weight of a fallen roof beam, but it was dry. Eliza sagged against the wall, her body shaking, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely breathe. The water streamed from her, pooling at her feet. "Fire," Caleb said, his voice rough. He dropped his saddlebag on the floor. "We have to get a fire." He looked around, found a small, dry pile of mesquite twigs and dried brush in the corner, likely a pack rat's nest. He pulled the flint and steel from his bag. Eliza moved to help, kneeling by the stove, her hands reaching for the tinder, but she was shaking too violently. Her fingers, numb and white, couldn't find a purchase. I can't," she chattered, her voice breaking with frustration and cold. Caleb watched her for a beat. The floppy, stained hat was gone, lost in the ride. Her dark auburn hair was plastered to her scalp and neck, rivulets of water tracing paths down her temples. The ridiculous duster, meant as a disguise, was now a trap, holding the cold water against her. In the dim, gray light of the storm, he wasn't looking at a hostage, or a weapon, or the daughter of his enemy. He was looking at a woman who was freezing to death. He knelt, gently pushing her hands aside. "Move!" His own hands were large and scarred, but steady. He struck the steel against the flint, once, twice. On the third strike, a spark caught the dry tinder. He blew on it softly, cupping it, protecting it, until a small, yellow flame licked to life. He carefully fed it the mesquite twigs, which hissed and smoked before finally catching. A weak, struggling warmth began to radiate from the stove. He looked back at Eliza. She was huddled, her arms wrapped around herself, but the shaking hadn't stopped. "Get out of that duster," he commanded. "And the dress. They're soaked. You'll be dead of lung fever by morning." She looked up, her eyes wide with alarm, pulling the duster tighter. "Don't be a fool," he snapped, his voice harsh to cover the new, unfamiliar worry. He turned to his saddlebag and pulled out the only dry thing he owned. It was an old wool shirt, gray and patched, but clean, folded neatly at the bottom. He shoved it at her. "It's all I have. Turn around. Change." Eliza looked at the shirt, then at his back as he deliberately turned away from her, affording her the privacy of the small, dark room. It was the most profound gesture of trust he could have offered. She turned her back to him, her fingers numb as she fumbled with the buttons of the duster. She let the heavy, wet canvas fall to the dirt floor with a wet slap. Caleb stood rigid, facing the shack's one small, grime-caked window, watching the rain turn the world into a gray blur. He tried not to listen, but the tiny shack held every sound. He heard the faint, sickening tear of wet silk as she struggled with the ruined bodice of her wedding dress. He heard the fabric, stuck to her skin, peeling away. And then he heard her sharp, involuntary hiss of pain as the wet cloth dragged across the raw rope burns on her wrists and the bruises that littered her shoulders and ribs. The sound was more intimate than any touch, a testament to the violence she had endured. Then, only the rustle of the dry wool shirt and the deafening drumming roar of the rain on the tin roof. "Caleb," her voice was small. He turned, his body tense. She was standing in the center of the tiny room, illuminated by the flickering, growing light from the stove. The shirt was enormous on her. It swallowed her. The sleeves rolled up a dozen times to free her hands, the hem falling to her knees like a dress. The collar, designed for his thick neck, was far too wide. It had slipped, falling completely off her left shoulder. The firelight caught the pale, damp skin of her collarbone, and there, stark and angry against her skin, was the dark, purple-black shadow of a bruise from the carriage crash. She tried to pull the collar up, her hand suddenly shy, but she was shivering too badly. Caleb moved before he had decided to. He took 2 steps, closing the distance between them. "Stay still," he murmured, his voice thick. He reached out, his calloused, rough hand, the hand of a rancher and a killer, went to the collar of the shirt. He intended only to fix it, to cover her, to restore the barrier between them. His fingers brushed her skin. The world stopped. Her skin was cold and damp from the rain, but his hand was a brand, radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the stove. She went utterly still, her breath catching in her throat. He stopped, his hand resting on the wool, his thumb brushing the soft skin of her shoulder. They stood frozen, not breathing, separated by inches but connected by that one, staggering point of contact. The air between them crackled. The roar of the storm outside sealed them in. The rest of the world, Jude, Barrett, Kane, the coming posse, all of it vanishing, leaving only this small, dark space and the sudden, terrifying pulse of life between them. She spoke first, her voice a raw whisper, her eyes locked on his. Back at the ranch, when Hales was in the yard, he didn't move. His hand was still on her shoulder. "I watched you," she said, her throat tight. "I saw your hand on your gun. I knew you were going to give me to him. For the $1,000, for your revenge, for your brother." She swallowed, a tear welling, defying the rain still dripping from her hair. "I said it again, in my head, the words I told my father, I'd rather die than be yours. But when you turned your back on him, when you threw his badge in the dust and chose me," her voice broke. I'm not sure anymore." Caleb's face, usually a mask of hard control, was shattered. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, hoarse rasp, dredged from a place of deep, agonizing truth. "I did," he admitted, and the confession felt like pulling a bullet. I thought about it. I saw the gold. I saw the water it could buy. I saw Thomas's grave. He let go of the shirt. But he didn't step back. The space between them remained charged. It was everything I've wanted for 4 years, a way to finally hurt him. What stopped you? She whispered. Thomas, he said, the name a piece of gravel in his throat. My brother. He was stubborn. He was young, but he was a good man. He died because he wouldn't sell. He would have despised me. He would have haunted me for the rest of my days if I used an innocent person as merchandise. I couldn't do it, not and still be his brother. The confession hung in the air, raw and exposed. He had bared his soul, his weakness and his strength, all in one breath. Eliza's expression, which had been fearful, then defiant, now dissolved into something new, something that terrified them both. Understanding. Slowly, she lifted her hand, her bandaged hand. Caleb flinched, an old, ingrained reaction, expecting a blow or a retreat. But she didn't retreat. She raised her hand to his face. She touched the old, pale scar on his jaw, the one from a knife fight years ago. Her fingers, still cold, traced the raised line of healed flesh, from his chin up toward his ear. It was a gesture of impossible bravery, to touch the mark of his own violent past. Her hand stopped, her palm cupping his rough, stubbled jaw, her thumb, soft and gentle, brushed across the hard line of his mouth. Caleb's eyes closed. The simple, gentle touch was his undoing. It breached all his defenses. He was a man built of rock and iron, and this woman was undoing him with a single soft touch. Oft. The rain hammered on the tin roof, a wild drumbeat for the sudden, fierce pounding in his chest. He opened his eyes. He looked at her mouth. He leaned in, closing the last trembling inch between them. His lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not a kiss of affection. It was a kiss of desperation, a kiss of two people who were seconds from death and had just, for the first time, found a reason to live. It was hesitant for only a fraction of a second. Rough, tasting of rain in the desert and the sudden, shared understanding of their grief. He was asking a question. Her lips parted, answering. The dam broke. The last 4 years of his lonely, burning rage and the entirety of her lifetime of gilded fear collapsed into this one single point. The kiss deepened, becoming hungry, overwhelming. His left hand, the one that had held the shirt, moved to the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her cold, damp hair, holding her steady. His other arm, the one with the healing graze, circled her back, pulling her flush against his chest, crushing the wool shirt between them. He held her as if he could absorb her, protect her from the world by pulling her into himself. Her hands, no longer shy, flew up, fisting in the wet, coarse fabric of his shirt. She clung to him, her knuckles white, holding on as if he were the only solid rock in the middle of the flood that was washing their world away. Their breath mingled, becoming ragged, hot in the cold air. Her heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the storm, a wild thing trapped and finally, impossibly, seen. The kiss broke, not because they wanted to, but because the need for air was too great. They didn't pull apart. Caleb, shaking with an emotion he hadn't let himself feel in years, rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were squeezed shut. He was trembling. Eliza's hands were still fisted in his shirt, her face pressed against his. They stood there, in the small, dark shack, wrapped in each other's arms, the fire crackling at their feet and the storm raging around them. She spoke first, her voice a raw, trembling whisper, her words brushing his skin. If we die tomorrow. He held her tighter, a pain sound deep in his chest. If Jude, if my father, if they come, and we die. She continued, a single, hot tear slipping from the corner of her eye, tracing a path through the grime on her temple. At least I didn't belong to him. She took a shuddering breath, her words finding their truth in the dark. At least, for this one night, I belong to my own choice." Caleb said nothing. He had no words. He just held her, his face buried in her hair, as the firelight reflected in the tear on her cheek, a small, warm spark of promise against the coming, cold dark. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the desert scrubbed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet creosote and the promise of life. The ride back to Silver Range Ranch was done in a tense, charged silence. The intimacy of the miner's shack, the heat of that desperate, rain-soaked kiss, hung between them, a fragile, unspoken thing in the new, clean air. They were no longer jailer and captive. They were something far more dangerous. Nora Duffy was waiting for them on the porch. She was not alone. With her stood two men Caleb recognized, their faces set in grim lines. One was Jed Miller, the rancher from the Cienega whom Cain had ruined. The other was Silas Croft, a dryland farmer whose well had been poisoned by Cain's men. They were the ghosts of Cain's ambition, and they were holding rifles. "They're coming," Nora said, skipping any greeting. Her voice was flat. "Jude's been on the telegraph wire to Prescott. He's not waiting for Hales to heal. He's raised a legal posse, claiming you," she nodded at Caleb. "Murdered 2 deputies and kidnapped a grieving bride. He's riding with 30 men, and he'll have a marshal's endorsement by morning." The reality of it settled on them. 30 men, a legal posse. They were not outlaws, they were the law. Caleb nodded, his face hardening as he stepped into the cabin, the others following. He moved to the table, his mind all tactical. 30 men is too many for the open. We'll have to bottleneck them in the pass, 6 miles out. Jed, you and Silas know that ridge. We can't fight them. Caleb, Nora cut him off, her voice heavy with frustration. Not in a straight fight. They'll ride over us in 10 minutes. They have the law. We'd be shot as murderers, and Jude would be a hero. The cabin was silent, the ticking of the clock on the mantel the only sound. Eliza, who had been standing by the cold stove, her hands clasped, spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. "He's coming to rescue me," she said, her eyes dark. Caleb turned to look at her. "He's painting me as the victim," Eliza continued, a strange, cold strength in her voice. "The hysterical, kidnapped bride. He's using me as his excuse." She took a breath. "So we will use it too. We will give him exactly what he wants." "What are you talking about?" Caleb asked, a new dread creeping into his voice. "A wedding," Eliza said. "He wants his bride. He wants his show. We will send word. I've escaped you. I've realized my mistake. I'm waiting for him. In the church, in Sable Cross. I'll agree to the marriage. I'll agree to everything. We will set a trap, and he will walk right into it, with my father at his side." The silence that followed was absolute, heavier and more profound than the storm. Jed Miller just stared, his mouth open. Caleb exploded. The chair he was leaning on screeched as he kicked it back. "Absolutely not," he roared, his voice bouncing off the low ceiling. The sudden violence made everyone flinch. "You are not going back to him. You are not putting your neck in his noose. That is not a plan. That is a death sentence. What we are doing now is a death sentence." Eliza stepped toward him, her eyes blazing, meeting his rage with her own cold fire. "They will come here. They will burn this ranch to the ground. And they will kill you. They will kill all of you. They will hunt me down. And they will drag me back. I was sold once by my father. I will not be used a second time as a legal excuse to murder the only man who—" She cut herself off, her breath catching. She steadied herself. "This time," she said, her voice dropping to a low, fierce intensity, "I set the terms. This time, I am selling myself, and the price is all of them. I will trade my life to see an end to this. I will not run." Caleb stared at her, his chest heaving, trapped between his tactical mind and the raw, protective instinct that was screaming at him. He saw the woman from the desert, the one who had pointed a shotgun at his chest. She was back. Nora Duffy broke the impasse. "The girl's right," she said, her voice grim. It's a terrible, insane idea, which is why it's the only one that might work. She looked at Eliza. Jude is an animal, but your father is an arrogant man. The idea that his daughter chooses to come back, that he wins, he will not be able to resist it. It's clean. The plan formed quickly, each piece falling into place with a cold, metallic click. One, Eliza would send a message to her father, carried by May from the saloon, agreeing to the ceremony to fix the scandal. It would be held at the church in Sable Cross. 2, Nora would take Jed, Silas, and 5 other ranchers' men who had lost everything and position them before dawn, in the belfry of the church, on the roof of the gilded cage, in the window of the empty assayer's office. They would have a crossfire on the entire town square. 3, Caleb would deliver her. He would play the part of the broken man, the captor who had been outmaneuvered or paid off. It didn't matter. He would hand her over at the church door. 4, the evidence. May. She gave me something, Eliza said, reaching into the deep pocket of the duster she still wore. She pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped packet. She took it from my father's desk, years ago, after my mother died, a private ledger. It shows the first payments to Jude, the security money. It shows the deal for the railroad, drawn up a month before they murdered Mr. Harris. She said my mother wanted me to have it, in case. My God, Nora whispered, taking the packet as if it were a holy relic. I will carry the Bible, Eliza said, and these papers will be inside it. When my father and Jude are both at the altar, when the town is watching, I will give it to you, Sheriff, and you will make your move. The night before the wedding was still and suffocating. The ranch was a ghost, waiting for its own funeral. Jed and Silas had ridden out to gather the other men, agreeing to meet Nora in town. Caleb and Eliza were alone. For the last time. He found her by the window, staring out at the hill where his brother was buried. He said nothing, just stood beside her. He was holding a small, 2-shot Derringer. It was beautifully made, with a pearl handle. This was my mother's, he said, his voice quiet. Eliza turned. He held it out to her. It is not a battle gun. It only holds 2 bullets. It's a coward's gun, or a woman's, but it's small. May had sent a dress, a simple, cream-colored wool dress, the kind a respectable woman might wear to Sunday service. It lay on the bed, a pale ghost in the lamplight. You will wear it, Caleb said, his voice clinical. Tucked into a garter on your thigh, or, if the sleeve is wide enough, you can rig it to a string. He stepped closer, taking her arm. His touch, which had been so desperate in the shack, was now the cold, detached touch of a soldier. But the electricity was still there. It sizzled in the small space between them. You'll have to practice, he murmured, his face close to hers, his voice low. He pushed up the sleeve of the wool shirt she still wore. You pull it, so. You let it drop into your hand. It must be one motion. His hand guided hers, positioning her fingers on the small trigger. His thumb brushed the back of her hand, and she felt the calluses, the strength, and the tremor he was trying to hide. This is not for the men on the roof, he whispered. This is for Jude. This is for when he is close enough to touch you. You do not hesitate. You press it against his ribs, and you pull the trigger. Twice. The lesson was brutal, an obscene parody of an embrace. He was teaching her to kill, and the intimacy of it, the memory of his lips on hers, was so overwhelming she felt dizzy. She pulled her arm away, the Derringer heavy in her hand. He didn't step back. His face was a mask of anguish. This is madness, he said, the words torn from him. This entire plan is madness. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip desperate. Take Ash. I've packed the saddlebags. There is water. There is ammunition. There is money. Ride south. Do not stop. Do not look back until you are across the border in Mexico. I will stay here. I will hold them off. I will give you a day. I will give you... Just go. Please. He was offering her an escape. He was offering to die for her. Eliza looked up at him, at the raw terror in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. She slowly, deliberately, put the derringer on the table. Then she raised her hand, not to his scar, not to his gun, but to his chest. She laid her palm flat, right over his heart, feeling the frantic, hammering beat. "If I run," she said, her voice soft but unbreakable, "Jude will kill you. He will hunt down Nora and Jed and Silas. He will burn this whole valley, and he will not stop until he finds me. He will hang me in a public square to prove his power." She looked into his eyes. "I am done running. I will not be the excuse for your death." Midnight. The Sable Cross Church was dark, save for a dozen tallow candles left burning on the altar, casting long, wavering shadows. It smelled of old wax, dust, and ozone from the recent storm. Nora was there, a shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. "Miller is in the belfry," she whispered, her voice echoing in the empty sanctuary. "Silas and the others are on the roofs. They'll be in place by dawn. We are set." Eliza stood near the front pew. She wore the cream-colored dress. It was simple, buttoned high to the throat. It made her look pure, respectable, deceptive. Caleb stood beside her. He wore a clean black shirt and his gun belt, the colt tied down low on his thigh. He looked like an undertaker, or a groom. Nora looked at the two of them, standing together in the candlelight, a strange, beautiful, and terrible sight. "This is a hell of a thing to ask. Eliza," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "It's the only thing to do," Eliza said, her hands clasped. Nora nodded, her face grim. "I'll make one last round. I'll see you at dawn." She slipped out a side door, leaving them alone. They stood in the silence, in the place where, in a few hours, the trap would be sprung. It was a wedding rehearsal and a battle plan, all in one. For one agonizing suspended moment, the rest of the world fell away. There was no Jude, no Barrett, no posse. There was only the candlelight, the scent of the candles, and the two of them, standing at an altar, the wedding they would never have. Caleb looked at her. The simple dress could not hide the fire in her, the bravery that shamed him. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that he loved this woman, and he knew, with that same certainty, that he was leading her to her death. He reached out, his hand shaking. He did not touch her scar, or her hand. He cupped her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheekbone, a gesture of profound, aching tenderness. "If anyone dies tomorrow," he said, his voice thick, breaking on the words, "it will be me." He looked at her, his eyes dark, filled with a terrible, burning vow. Not his wife. He could not bring himself to say yours. He could not claim her, not now, not when he was the one walking her into the line of fire. But his eyes, and the desperate, possessive pressure of his hand on her face, said it all. Dawn broke over Sable Cross, not with the soft promise of a new day, but with the hard, metallic glare of a final judgment. The town was awake. It was packed. The main street, usually empty save for a few stray dogs, was thick with people. They had come from their dusty homesteads and failing ranches, drawn by the rumor of the impossible, a second wedding for Barrett Kane's daughter, a public display of power. They stood in clusters, silent and watchful, their faces grim. They were not here to celebrate. They were here as witnesses, curious and terrified to see what final piece of their world Barrett Kane would claim. A low rumble grew from the east. It was the sound of expensive, well-oiled wheels. A fine black carriage, drawn by 4 perfectly matched black horses, rolled into town, its brass fittings gleaming in the morning sun. It was a vehicle of obscene luxury in this land of drought and dust. Surrounding it, riding like cavalry, was an escort of 20 men, all armed with new Winchester rifles and matching Colts, their gun belts heavy. They were not cowboys. They were private soldiers, Jude Marlowe's army. The carriage stopped in front of the gray, leaning church. The door opened. Barrett Kane stepped out first. He was older, perhaps 65, but he stood with the ramrod straightness of a man who had never been told no. He wore a fine black suit, his silver hair brushed back. He looked like a governor, his eyes sweeping over the silent crowd with a look of cold, satisfied ownership. Then Jude Marlowe emerged. He was a stark, brutal contrast. He wore his gun belt over a black vest, his hand never leaving the worn handle of his revolver. A cruel, triumphant smirk was plastered on his face. He saw the townsfolk, saw their fear, and he drank it in like fine whiskey. He was a wolf who had just been handed the keys to the henhouse. He looked at the church, at his prize, and his smirk widened. On the far side of the square, another pair approached, on foot. It was Caleb Rowan, in his clean black shirt, and the woman, Eliza, in her simple cream-colored dress. The crowd parted for them, a silent, shuffling wave. Caleb walked stiffly, his face a mask of granite. He was playing the part of the defeated man. Eliza, holding a large, leather-bound Bible in her bandaged hands, walked beside him. Her head bowed. She looked every inch the repentant, obedient bride. Caleb's hand rested lightly on her elbow. To the crowd, it looked like a formal escort. To Eliza, it felt like a desperate, trembling grip, the last touch of the man who had held her in the storm, his silent promise to follow her into the fire. They reached the church steps. Jude Marlowe was waiting for them, blocking the door. "Rowan," Jude sneered, his eyes raking over Caleb with contempt. "I'm surprised you have the sense to return stolen property." Caleb's jaw worked, but he said nothing. His orders were to hand her over, to let the trap close. "And you, my dear," Jude said, his gaze dropping to Eliza. He reached out and grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. His thumb pressed into her skin. "You've caused a great deal of trouble, but I suppose a spirited horse is more fun to break." Eliza did not flinch. She just stared at him, her face pale, her eyes empty. Caleb's hand, the one not on her elbow, had clenched into a white-knuckled fist at his side. He was vibrating with a rage so profound it threatened to shatter the entire plan. "Go inside. Father," Jude said to Barrett, his eyes still locked on Eliza. "Let's get this farce over with. I have a wedding night to attend to." Barrett Kane nodded, satisfied, and swept into the church. Taking his seat in the front pew, Jude grabbed Eliza's arm and yanked her from Caleb's side. Caleb let her go. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He followed them inside, his eyes scanning, noting the position of Kane's 5 personal guards, 2 by the door, 3 in the pews near Barrett. He moved to the back, by a support pillar, a shadow in the corner. The church was packed. May was in the back, her face grim. Jed Miller and Silas Croft were not visible, nor were the others. They were in their places. Nora Duffy, in her sheriff's uniform, stood near the pulpit, by the side wall, ostensibly to keep the peace. She looked small and official and completely overwhelmed. It was a perfect performance. The preacher, a thin, nervous man whose salary was paid by Barrett Kane, began to speak, his voice trembling. He rushed through the opening words, his eyes darting between Jude and Barrett. "And now," he stammered, we come to the vows. Jude Marlowe, do you take this woman, Eliza Monroe, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Jude did not look at the preacher. He was looking at Eliza. He leaned in, close to her face, but he spoke in a loud, carrying voice, a voice for the entire town to hear. "I seem to recall a conversation we had. Miss Monroe," he said, his voice a cruel purr. "You said, what was it? Oh, yes, you'd rather die than be mine." The church went utterly, deathly silent. The only sound was a baby crying somewhere in the back, and then even that was hushed. Jude smiled. "Today, my dear, I am giving you a chance to answer that again, in front of God and all these good people. So, what is it to be?" This was it, the pivot, the moment the world would either crack open or slam shut forever. Eliza stood motionless. Caleb's heart stopped. He could see the pulse beating in her throat. She turned her head, just slightly, and her eyes found his, across the crowded, silent church. She held his gaze for one. Single, agonizing second. It was a promise. Then she turned back to Jude. She lifted her chin. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper. It was clear, strong, and it rang with the cold, pure sound of a bell. I'd rather die than be yours. Jude's smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of stunned, purple rage. The public humiliation, the final defiance, was more than he could bear. His hand, which had been resting on his gun, drew it from the holster with a speed that blurred the eye. "You stupid," he began, shoving the barrel of the Colt toward her chest. "Now!" Caleb roared, his voice a cannon shot that shattered the silence. It was the signal. Chaos erupted. The stained glass window high above the altar exploded inward in a shower of colored glass as Jed Miller's rifle barrel punched through it. The trapdoor to the belfry flew open, and Silas Croft and another rancher opened fire, not at the crowd, but at the ceiling, sending splinters and plaster raining down, creating panic. From the rooftops across the square, the crack of rifles began, pinning Jude's men, who were still outside with the horses, in a deadly crossfire. Inside the church, as Jude's gun came up, Eliza moved. She was not a victim. She was a soldier. She dropped the heavy Bible, and her hand, the one hidden in the folds of her dress, reappeared. It was holding the pearl-handled derringer. She didn't aim. She acted just as Caleb had taught her. She shoved the tiny, two-shot weapon against Jude's right hand, the one holding the Colt, and pulled the trigger. The pop of the small-caliber gun was lost in the roar of the rifles, but the effect was immediate. Jude screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and surprise. The bullet had torn through his hand. His Colt clattered to the floorboards. Caleb was already moving. He had launched himself from the back of the church the instant he yelled. He didn't use his gun. This was not a shooting. This was a reckoning. He hit Jude Marlowe with all his weight, a 200-pound missile of focused rage. The tackle slammed Jude backward, away from Eliza, crashing them both over the front pew. Wood splintered. They went down in a tangle of limbs, struggling violently in the narrow aisle. Eliza's cream-colored dress, the one meant for her wedding, was caught under Jude's boot. He twisted, stomping on it, and the fabric tore, ripping from waist to hem. "Kill them!" Barrett Kane roared, his face white with fury, realizing he had been tricked. "Kill them all!" His 3 personal guards in the pews drew their guns, turning them on the panicking townsfolk, turning them on Caleb, who was on the floor, his hands around Jude's throat. One of the guards leveled his pistol at Caleb's exposed back. Barrett Kane, a new voice, cold and powerful, cut through the din. Sheriff Nora Duffy had moved from the wall. In her hands, she no longer held a pistol. She held a double-barreled shotgun, and its twin muzzles were pressed firmly against the back of Barrett Kane's expensive suit. "Tell your men to drop their guns," she commanded, her voice amplified by the pulpit. "Or so help me God, I will cut you in half." Barrett froze, the cold steel pressed against his spine. He saw the look in Nora's eyes. She was not a woman he had bought. She was a woman who had nothing left to lose. Hold your fire," Barrett choked out, his arrogance collapsing. Nora shoved him, hard, out from the pew, dragging him by the collar to the front of the altar. She forced him down to his knees, in front of the preacher, in front of the entire town. "You are under arrest," she declared, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "For the murder of Thomas Rowan, for the poisoning of the Croft well, for the burning of the Miller Ranch, and for the murder of the railroad man. Mr. Harris." "Lies," Barrett shrieked. "You have no proof. You have nothing. Just the word of a hysterical woman. We have this, May, the old woman from the saloon, was at the aisle." She held up the oilskin packet Eliza had given her. She pulled out the ledger book. His own hand, ladies and gentlemen, his own numbers. She began to pass the pages, not to the sheriff, but to the people, to the ranchers and farmers in the pews. They were passed from hand to hand. A current of revelation, of dawning, horrified understanding, the proof of their own ruin. written in their oppressor's elegant script. On the floor, Caleb had Jude pinned, his forearm pressed across the gunman's throat. Jude was choking, his face purple, his free hand clawing at Caleb's arm. But as Caleb's attention was diverted for 1 second by Nora's voice, Jude, in a final, desperate move, saw his chance. His boot was still tangled in the ruins of Eliza's dress. He yanked it free. He saw one of Cain's guards, the one Nora had forced to drop his gun. The weapon lay on the floor, just 3 feet away. With a surge of desperate strength, Jude kicked Caleb in the ribs, sending him reeling back. Jude scrambled, not for his own ruined hand, but for the fallen gun. His fingers closed around the new Colt. He rolled onto his knees, his face a mask of blood and pure hatred. His left hand, his good hand, bringing the gun up. Caleb was still on the floor, trying to regain his footing, his back completely exposed. Eliza, standing by the altar, saw it all. Jude Marlowe leveled the gun, not at her, but at the back of the man she loved. The next shot would decide everything. Jude Marlowe's finger tightened on the trigger. The church, for one impossible, elongated second, was a silent photograph Eliza. Her hand still raised from shooting him. Caleb, his body tensed, rising from the floor. Barrett, his face a mask of white rage. And Jude, his face a snarl of hatred. His good hand leveling a new gun at Caleb's unprotected back. The gun bucked in his hand. A deafening bang filled the sanctuary. But Caleb did not fall. In the same terrible instant, another sound had ripped through the air, the heavy, deafening boom of a shotgun. Sheriff Nora Duffy, with a speed that belied her years, had seen Jude scramble for the gun. She had pivoted from Barrett, keeping the shotgun at her hip, and fired her second barrel. The blast of buckshot was not aimed at Jude's head, but at his arm. The spray of lead shot tore into Jude's left shoulder and arm, the sheer kinetic force spinning him like a top. His own shot, aimed true for Caleb's heart, was jerked violently to the side. The bullet, however, was not entirely denied. It was a hot, invisible hornet. It tore through the air and found Caleb, not in the spine, but in his side. He roared, a sound of pained surprise, as the bullet sliced a fiery, bloody furrow along his ribs. The impact staggered him, and a dark, wet stain instantly began to spread across his black shirt. The 2 shots were the breaking of the dam. The spell of fear was shattered, and the church erupted. "Kill them! Kill them all!" Barrett screamed, his voice a panicked shriek. His remaining 2 guards, seeing Nora's shotgun now smoking and empty, raised their pistols, but they never fired. From the high, shattered stained glass window, the crack of Jed Miller's rifle echoed. One of the guards pitched forward, his shot going harmlessly into the wooden floor. From the belfry, Silas Croft's gun boomed, and the second guard crumpled against the church wall. The entire church was in motion. The townsfolk, the silent, beaten-down ranchers and farmers, were not running in panic. They were fighting back. May, the old woman from the saloon, grabbed the pistol from the guard Silas had dropped and leveled it at 2 of Cain's men by the door. In the pews, men who had looked like simple farmers, the men Nora had deputized, threw back their coats, revealing old army revolvers and hunting rifles. Caleb's plan, Nora's plan, had worked. They had not just been snipers. They had armed the congregation. The Cain men, caught in a deadly trap between the snipers on the roofs, the men in the belfry, and a suddenly, furiously armed populace, were thrown into chaos. The church became a bedlam of smoke, splintering wood, and shouting. Jude Marlowe saw it all. Wounded, bleeding from Nora's buckshot, his first instinct was not to fight, but to survive. He saw Caleb, clutching his bleeding side, his face pale with pain and rage. Taking a step toward him, he saw Eliza, her eyes wide, standing by the altar, the pearl-handled derringer still smoking in her hand. He lunged, not for Caleb, not for a gun, he lunged for her. He grabbed Eliza by the hair with his shattered, bleeding right hand, yanking her head back with a scream. He wrapped his good left arm around her throat, dragging her backward, pulling her body in front of his like a shield. "Stop," he bellowed, his voice ragged. "Stop shooting, or she dies. I'll break her neck right here." The shooting stopped. Instantly, Jed, in the window, lowered his rifle. Nora froze, her empty shotgun useless. Caleb stopped, his Colt raised, his face a mask of agony. "That's right," Jude spat, tasting the blood in his own mouth. He pressed the barrel of the guard's gun, the one he had not dropped, hard against Eliza's temple. The cold metal made her flinch. "We're walking out," Jude snarled, dragging her backward, step by agonizing step, down the aisle. The torn panels of her cream-colored dress dragged on the floor, snagging on the bodies of the men who had died for her family. He pulled her through the splintered double doors of the church and out into the bright, terrified sunlight of the town square. The square was a war zone. 2 of his men lay dead by the carriage. The others were pinned down behind a water trough, exchanging sporadic desperate fire with the unseen riflemen on the rooftops. Jude dragged Eliza into the middle of the street, a clear target for everyone. Caleb followed them, stumbling out onto the church porch. He was bleeding heavily now. One hand pressed hard against his side, the other holding his revolver, his arm extended, his hand shaking. "Let her go. Jude!" Caleb's voice was strained, breathless from the pain. Jude laughed, a harsh, grating sound that turned into a bloody cough. He spun, keeping Eliza between them, the gun never leaving her head. "You want your revenge, Rowan," he taunted, his face a mask of sweat, blood, and hatred. "You've been waiting for this. You want the man who helped burn your pathetic little ranch. You want the man who was going to take your woman?" He shoved Eliza forward, her body shielding his, her eyes wide with terror. "Shoot!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Shoot through her to get me. This is the only chance you will ever get. Fire your gun." Caleb stood there, his world reduced to the front sight of his revolver, the dark, terrified eye of the woman he loved, and the leering, triumphant face of the man behind her, for the second time in his life. Caleb Rowan froze. This was the choice. His brother's blood screaming for vengeance on one side, and Eliza's life on the other. He saw Thomas's face, cold and still by the spring. He saw the fire that had consumed his past. All he had to do was pull the trigger. He would kill them both. His revenge would be complete, and his life would be over. But he also saw her face in the rain, in the dark of the miner's shack. He saw her hand, bandaged, touching his scar. He saw her standing by the altar, choosing this, choosing him. His finger was on the trigger. He could not pull it. His arm trembled, weakened by blood loss, but more by the impossible, agonizing weight of the choice. He could not sacrifice her. He could not become the monster who killed the innocent to get the guilty. Revenge, the thing that had driven him for 4 empty years, was right in front of him, and he could not take it. He was going to fail. Eliza saw it. She saw the sweat on his pale forehead. She saw the dark stain spreading at his side. She saw the unbearable agony in his eyes, the shake in his hand. He was freezing, not from fear, but for her. Jude saw it too, and he laughed. "He doesn't have the guts. He's weak, Rowan, just like your dead brother, too weak to—" "Don't you dare die for me, Caleb Rowan!" Eliza's shriek was not a plea. It was a command. It was a raw, furious scream that ripped through the square. It was not a distraction. It was an attack. She stomped the heel of her boot, the only thing she could move, down onto Jude's foot, grinding it into the bone with all her weight. Jude roared, an animal sound, his grip on her throat loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed, as he reflexively bent toward the pain in his foot. Eliza drove her elbow backward, not with grace, but with desperate life-or-death strength. She jammed it into his wounded left side, directly into the torn flesh and broken ribs where Nora's buckshot had hit. A white-hot, electric agony seized Jude's entire body. He gasped, his muscles locking, his body spasming in a way he could not control. His hand flinched, the gun barrel, pressed to her temple. Jerked up, pointing at the empty blue sky for one perfect, suspended half-second. Caleb had not moved. He had been waiting. He did not aim for the head or the heart. He aimed to end the threat. Bang! His Colt fired. The sound was sharp, definitive. The bullet struck Jude high in his right shoulder, the one that had been shot by Eliza's Derringer. The new, heavy-caliber round shattered what was left of the bone, spinning him completely around. The stolen gun flew from his useless, shattered hand, clattering into the red dust. Eliza was free. She fell, scrambling away, collapsing to the ground, her chest heaving, her body shaking with reaction, her eyes locked on Caleb. Jude stumbled 2 steps, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. He looked at his ruined hands, looked at Caleb, and then pitched forward, his body hitting the street in a cloud of dust. He did not move. Inside the church, it was over. The remaining Cain men, seeing Jude fall, seeing their leader captured, and surrounded by a town that had finally found its spine, threw down their guns. "I order you!" Barrett Cain, still on his knees, shrieked at them. "I'll pay you double. Kill them all." But no one moved. His power, which had been built on money and fear, had evaporated. The money meant nothing, and the fear had just been conquered. Caleb Rowan, his hand pressed to his side, his Colt still smoking, walked. He walked past the chaos of the square, past the whimpering, wounded body of Jude Marlowe. He walked back into the silent church. He walked past the townsfolk who parted for him like the sea, their faces a mix of awe and terror. He walked past Nora Duffy, who was breathing hard, her empty shotgun in her hands. He walked until he stood directly in front of the kneeling, broken man who had started it all. He kicked Nora's shotgun aside. She let him. He pressed the hot, smoking muzzle of his .45 Colt pistol directly into the soft skin of Barrett Cain's forehead. The church was so quiet. The only sound was the steady drip, drip, drip of Caleb's blood onto the wooden floor. This was the moment. 4 years of cold, lonely nights, the face of his 19-year-old brother, the smell of his burning home, the end of his life. It all culminated in this one. Simple, final pressure of his finger. He could kill him. He could end the bloodline. He could finally have his peace. Barrett Cain was weeping, his eyes squeezed shut, snot and tears running down his face. The powerful cattle baron was just a terrified old man, smelling the gunpowder and his own death. Caleb's finger tightened. He saw Thomas's face. He saw the fire. And then he saw Eliza. She was standing in the open doorway of the church, her torn dress covered in dust, her face streaked with tears, her hand over her mouth. She was watching him. He saw her, and he saw the future he had kissed in the storm. He saw the man he would have to become to deserve her. A man who built, not just a man who destroyed, with a ragged, shuddering gasp that felt like it was tearing his soul in two. Caleb Rowan did the second, and most unthinkable, thing. He lowered the gun. The collective breath of the entire town rushed back in. Caleb turned, his face a mask of an agony far deeper than the bullet in his side. He looked at Nora. "He doesn't deserve a quick death?" Caleb choked out, the words tasting like ash and bile. "He doesn't deserve a soldier's end. Let the jury hear what his daughter has to say. Let him rot in a cell." He had chosen. He had chosen justice over revenge. He had chosen her over his ghosts. In the street, a shape moved. Jude Marlowe was not dead. He was crawling, fueled by a last, venomous reserve of hatred. He was dragging his shattered body through the dust, ignored by the crowd. He was pulling himself toward the gun he had dropped. Eliza, her breath still catching in her chest, saw the movement. Caleb was inside, his back to the door. Nora was cuffing Barrett. No one saw Jude but her, his good left hand, bloody and torn, stretched out. His fingers brushed the wooden grip of the Colt. Eliza's hand, which had been at her breast, moved. The pearl-handled Derringer, the second shot. She pulled it out. Her hand was shaking, but her eyes were cold as ice. Jude's fingers closed on the gun. He began to lift it, his arm trembling with the effort. trying to aim it at the black-shirted back of the man in the church doorway. A final shot rang out, echoing across the silent square. It was not the loud bang of a Colt. It was the small, sharp pop of the pearl-handled gun. In the red dust of the street, the crawling figure went rigid, and then, finally, was still. The morning after was not quiet. It was filled with the sounds of a town rebuilding itself. The air in Sable Cross, thick for years with fear and dust, was now sharp with the scent of gunpowder, charred wood from a few stray fires, and something new, the smell of rain on thirsty earth. The church was a ruin of splintered pews and shattered glass. But someone, Nora Duffy, Caleb guessed, had climbed to the belfry. The bell was ringing, a weak, cracked, but steady dong, 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 that echoed across the valley. Nora, her face lined with exhaustion but her eyes clear, stood on the courthouse steps. "That," she said to the crowd, "is the death knell for the age of Barrett Kane." The trial was not a trial. It was a reckoning. It was held right there in the dusty street, a makeshift court formed by Nora, the newly arrived Western Meridian Line representatives who had been waiting for Jude's posse, and a jury of 12 ranchers and townsfolk, Jed Miller at their head. Barrett Kane, his fine suit stained with dirt, his hands cuffed in front of him, sat on a wooden crate. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified silence. The evidence Eliza had provided, the ledger, the letters, the railroad contracts was read aloud, each entry a nail in Kane's coffin, one by one. Farmers and ranchers stood up, their voices shaking with a rage held back for years, telling their stories of cut fences, burned barns, and stolen water. Eliza stood last. She did not weep. She spoke with a clear, cold voice, not as his daughter, but as the final witness. She told them about Mr. Harris. She told them about Jude. She told them about the stable boy, Peter. She laid her father's empire bare, and with every word, she was cutting the final, toxic cord that bound her to him. When she was finished, she walked away. She did not stay for the verdict, or for the sentencing. She did not need to. She saw her father being led, not to a rope, but to a prison wagon bound for the territorial prison in Yuma. It was a fate worse than death. She stood at a distance, by the blacksmith's shop, and watched the wagon disappear, a small black speck in the vast, indifferent desert. She did not wave, she did not say a word. She just watched until he was gone, and then she let out a breath she felt she had been holding for her entire life. Jude Marlowe was buried in a plain pine box, in an unmarked grave at the edge of the town's small cemetery. Eliza stood over the fresh mound of dirt, the pearl-handled derringer heavy in her duster pocket. She felt no pride in the act, no satisfaction. She had not killed him for revenge. She had killed him to protect. She felt only a profound, weary sadness, not for him, but for the waste of it all, for the cruelty a man could hold. She whispered no words of forgiveness, only a final, quiet goodbye to the nightmare that had almost consumed her. Caleb had been carried back to Silver Range Ranch. The bullet had ripped through his side, cracking a rib and taking a lot of blood. But it had missed anything vital. He was alive, which, he reflected, was a miracle he hadn't earned. He woke 2 days later in his own bed, the scent of herbs and clean linen in the air. Eliza was asleep in the chair by his side, her head resting on her arms on the mattress, her bandaged hand near his. He lay there for a long time, watching her, the simple, quiet reality of her presence a balm on his soul. When he was able to stand, wincing with every breath, he found his ranch was no longer empty. Jed Miller, Silas Croft, and a half-dozen other men were in his yard. They were not talking. They were working. They were rebuilding the corral Hales's men had damaged. They were clearing the debris from the fight. They were digging a new channel from the spring that had flowed with new, clear water after the storm to the main trough. "Jed," Caleb said, his voice rough. Standing on the porch, Jed Miller looked up from his work, his face grim, but his eyes were alive. "Sheriff says this land's water rights are under review by the new council." "What council?" "The one we're forming," Jed said, gesturing with his shovel. "With you on it. Seems the railroad men, when they heard what you did and what she did, they decided they'd rather be in business with honest men. They're backing our claims against Cain's land grabs." He dug the shovel into the wet earth. "You fought for us, Caleb. Now we're building for you." Caleb watched them, his throat thick. He had spent 4 years as a ghost, nursing a cold hatred. And in 2 days, in one act of choosing justice over revenge, he had found a community. He had found a home, life settled, not into peace, but into the hard, steady rhythm of rebuilding. Eliza stayed. It was an unspoken, assumed thing. She had nowhere else to go, and he realized, would have torn the world apart to keep her from leaving. She cooked, she cleaned. She learned to patch his worn shirts. He worked the land, his body healing, his strength returning. They moved around each other in the small cabin, a silent, careful dance of 2 people who had shared a battlefield and a kiss, and were terrified of what came next. The memory of the miner's shack, of his lips on hers, was a constant, unspoken presence, a charge in the air that made every accidental brush of their hands a small shock. One evening, a month after the fight, Nora Duffy rode out. She was leading a horse, a strong bay mare with a good saddle. "This is yours," Nora said to Eliza. "Paid for by the Western Meridian Line. A bonus for your testimony. They've seized all of Cain's assets. The man will never see daylight again." She handed Eliza a thick packet of papers. "And this, the new county council is asking you to be the primary witness in the federal case against the corruption in Prescott. They want you to come and speak, to tell your story." She then turned to Caleb. "And this is for you, Rowan. They voted. You're the head of the new water commission. It's your job to divide Cain's old water rights, to see that it's done fairly." They stood there, the papers in their hands, the future of the valley suddenly resting on their shoulders. That afternoon, the sun was hot, but the air was clean. The drought had broken. Small, courageous patches of green grass, spurred by the rain, were pushing up through the red dust. Caleb was sitting under the lone cottonwood tree by his brother's grave. He had just finished carving a new wooden marker. It didn't say anything about revenge. It just said his name, Thomas Rowan, a good man. Eliza walked up, shading her eyes from the sun. She stood beside him, looking at the small grave. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked up at her, not understanding. "That day, in the church," she clarified. "Do you regret not killing him? Not pulling the trigger when his life was in your hand? Do you regret choosing the law instead of your revenge?" Caleb looked at the grave. He thought of the 4 years he had spent talking to this piece of wood, fueling his hatred. He thought of the black, empty hole in his soul. "Every night," he said, his voice low and honest, "I still see my brother's face. When I close my eyes, I still want to kill him for it. That part never goes away." He looked up, and his gray eyes, which had been so cold, were now clear and steady. "But then, I see you, standing in the doorway. I see you in the rain. I see you right here." He reached out, not to her arm, but to her hand, the one that was no longer bandaged. He took it. His calloused palm was warm against hers. "If I had pulled that trigger," he said, his voice thick, "I would have been just like him. Another monster, another man who took what he wanted, for his own reasons. I would have lost. I would have lost the last piece of my brother, and I would have lost you." Eliza's eyes filled with tears. She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that felt as new as the green grass. "I'd rather die than be yours," she whispered. Caleb's hand tightened on hers, a flash of the old fear in his eyes. "If yours meant belonging to your anger," she continued, her voice trembling but strong, "belonging to that endless, cold hatred, to a man who was owned by his own ghosts." She stepped closer, using her free hand to brush the hair from his forehead. "But if yours means planting this grass, mending these fences, arguing about whether we should buy more cattle or more books. She took a shuddering breath, her heart in her eyes. Then I choose to live with you. Caleb Rowan, the man who had faced down death, who had frozen twice in the face of an impossible choice, now knew exactly what to do. He didn't speak. He did not have the words. He stood up, pulling her gently with him. Then, in the shadow of the cottonwood tree, with his brother as his only witness, he knelt in the red dust. He didn't have a ring of gold or silver. He reached to his belt, to the leather thong he used to tie down his holster. He untied it, a simple, worn, leather strip. He held it out to her, not in his hand, but on his open palm, an offering from a simple, violent, and finally, whole man. I can't promise you a rich life, Eliza, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he had never known. I can't promise I won't make mistakes. I can't even promise I won't still be angry at the world. He looked up at her, his love for her a raw, undeniable thing. But I will promise this. I will promise you will always be your own, and I will promise I will never, ever sell you. Not for any man, not for any plan, and not for any ghost. The story ends there, or perhaps it begins, with the two of them, standing on that hill, ash grazing nearby on the impossible, new green grass, in a West where so many people belong to the land, to their debts, or to their guns. Caleb and Eliza were two of the rare few who belonged only to their own choices, and now, finally, to each other. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please, drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us your support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by more folks.